Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Alan. So you can start your session now.
Okay. So if you don't understand something, you can stop me. I think it's better to ask a question directly. The presentation here is only about theory of the ISG, so I'll first go through this so that we can understand the concept, and then later on we'll go through some lab. So what I have prepared so far is in one of the UCS image like this with Ubuntu, and you can do a lot of stuff on this one. I still need to do the SR5K image because I had some trouble with that platform. So anyway, let's start with the ISG. So originally, if you search the documentation, you will see SSG that is referring sometimes to service policy on iOS, and eventually he never made it to iOS XE, but it was actually the predecessor of ISG. And problem is that since iOS moved to iOS XE, some people actually moved some of the commands that were still available in SSG, which was the past config back to in SSG. So some of the commands are still, so it's a bit confused sometimes when you see some radius exchange and you don't really know what it is. If you start seeing exa value is probably coming from the SSG. And like I said, this software is still supported. So what's the idea of an ISG or SSG before, or even BNG in iOS XR, is to give some specific policy to a customer. For example, you could compare, today you can maybe put an access list on an interface, but obviously it's affecting all the users that will cross that interface. So what if you could create one access list per subscriber? You can already do it in PPP, but you cannot do it with IP, but eventually with ISG you could do it, assign a specific configuration for a subscriber. There's a concept of service in ISG and a concept of user. So we'll see a bit the different stuff later on in this config that we can go. So where do you see an ISG? Obviously it's called ISG, but it's not really a software that is called ISG. It's an iOS XE version that will run and will support it. In the latest Polaris, you need to enable some base license, advanced enterprise, so boot license, sorry. Some of the cases we've seen before happening. Here, this is where the SR1K will be. Maybe you still have some ISG config on the 10K, could also be. So it's here. The subscriber is actually here. I don't know if I can really draw something. Annotate maybe. Can use this one. Okay. So here you have the subscriber. What is the subscriber? Obviously somebody doing IP or IPv6. Where is it located? It could be at different places. So today you have a DSL user here. On the back of a modem that is doing DSL, obviously, you have a DSL infrastructure here. You have Wi-Fi users, so some of them directly on the Wi-Fi, so you could potentially do this in the lab, for example. Everybody that is Wi-Fi goes first through an ISG. Then there's Wi-Fi users that actually mix with mobile wireless. So service provider like the one in US is using this a lot. He can offload a subscriber from the mobile wireless network into a Wi-Fi network because he sends some command on the mobile device. And so this user become a Wi-Fi user and then eventually will cross the ISG. In that case, the ISG here would eventually go to the GGSN or depending if it's 4G, you will eventually go to LMA or something like this. So there's an added functionality with IWAC. in this case where this user can be forwarded through the SG as if it was a mobile user, because this device actually doesn't make any difference if it's actually coming from here or a real SGSN device that was running in the mobile network. So that's a bit the topology that you will see around. Obviously, to create all those functionality of assigning specific specific stuff to the subscriber, we will actually need some radius, or in the case of redirection and all that stuff, you will see some portal. What is it used for? This one is, for example, you go to the airport and you need to be redirected. You can enter username and password. Radius over here, like we thought. In the case you're doing prepaid, you will see prepaid server. Obviously, you will also interact with some of the DHCP server if the DHCP is external. Somebody is not on mute and is making some noise, so maybe if you can put yourself on mute. Thank you. So this is what you will see in the configuration: subscriber access, some interface, user profile, service profile is actually the same in the case of Radius. For Radius, the only one thing actually matters. He wants the username and the password. Whatever he returns is what the box here understands from it. If the box was sending something to the Radius to have a user authenticate, Radius will not see the difference, as opposed to the box sending something to have information of a service. For Radius, doesn't matter. The only thing you need is a username and the password. So the concept of service is here, not in Radius. And then obviously we will have some redirection cases with ISG and so on. So we'll do some lab with those functionality that you see here later on. I guess I have to stop annotating. Okay, so there's a concept of first sign of life, which is here, actually FSOL. You're probably going to see this also if you ever do BNG. It's the same name, first sign of life. It's not something very complicated. In the case of DHCP, it will be the DHCP discovery. In the case of PVP, it will be a PADI. So it's just the first time we see the subscriber. This part is actually handled on the subscriber side of the ISG. So there's first phase of recognizing that we're going to do ISG is probably going on the LAD interface and seeing this kind of stuff here, like IP subscriber. Why is it? Because we need to learn the subscriber. In case of PVP, you don't have this because it's under the virtual template, because PVP will be recognized directly. But in case of IP, you don't have any functionality like authentication or something that would eventually recognize the user. So you eventually need to discover the user, and by discovering, you need to configure it. How do you want to discover this user? So you want to do on MAC address, you want to do on DHCP, you want to do on IP address. It's up to the customer design eventually, because here we see it's an L2 connect, so we try to recognize the user by looking at something in the layer 2, which in this case could be DHCP. It's an old presentation, so you will not see the clusterware anymore because it's done by default now in ISG. So, but eventually, if you can pick up the discover going through that interface, you will recognize the user because you will see the MAC address. And then it's up to the ISG to do the rest of the stuff. So important.
Hey, Alan, I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
So in the first sign of life, you're saying DHCP discovery is coming from the client. So will it not have the subscriber, I'm assuming, he will already have an IP address, right?
No.
Session?
No, nothing.
So okay, so I mean, if the subscriber is coming from a mobile wireless, right? So they already have a IP association, and then they are trying to connect to the internet, right? So how will it work?
actually, let me take the annotate. Okay, so if I look at how it's gonna work, so you have this. Eventually, I'll try to design some iPod or whatever. So this is your mobile phone here, and then you actually going through an antenna. Eventually, well, that's my antenna. And this antenna eventually connect through the mobile radio access network through an SGSN that eventually will open the GTP tunnel to the GGSN, for example, right? So I don't know why this stuff always changes, but okay. So this is my GGSN. GGSN has a pool for his APN, and so every time this request is done and he matches some APN name, he will pick up an address from this pool, for example. So what's happening when this telco or this service provider actually tell this mobile to switch to the IP network, because he enter actually a shopping center, and this guy, this service provider, has some coverage over there, so he can actually tell this mobile to move to IP. And so he goes into the Wi-Fi world. Obviously, at this point, this guy is nothing aware of what's going to happen here. He does know his IP address, and for the moment he still has it from this APN pool. But how can he communicate to a wireless here, maybe a layer 2 network in general, up to this ISG that is actually here, because he actually need to enter somewhere here, this interface. And he's probably going across VLANs and all that stuff, so eventually later on he moved to another network, but there's also still a coverage, but the IP address location is different, or it's even another ISG. So how would this box actually realize where you need to send this IP address that is actually here? It's moving all the time. So what we need to do is first triggering this user. And the only way to trigger is not by sending this IP address that we get from GGSN before. We will trigger by the discover. So this mobile actually sends a discover. Discover is nice because it can cross everything. It's a broadcast packet, and it arrives here. This DHCP IP subscriber functionality recognized that this MAC address was never seen before, so it must be a new user. So we'll go obviously across this service policy here, and for IRAC the service policy will be authenticate the user, and our user is then authenticate with the radius, and radius due to back office knows what he actually needs to send to this user, and he will send the APN, the GGSN he needs to connect, and eventually the IP address he doesn't care. Because once this guy actually moved back to here, he actually reopened a new GTP, which could be like a roaming for this GGSN, and then he actually can forward the IP address that was allocated to the guy back into this connection via the SG, and the SG will act as a DHCP server in this case for this IP address, and then will send reply to that discover that was originated from this iPhone or whatever mobile phone you have. And then since now we have a DHCP transaction, we can keep aware of that user. So we'll go, of course, through the request offer. Once the user disappears or is gone for a while and there's some setup in IG that he actually can time out, it will disappear. If eventually the GGSN decide to close this GTP because he saw the user somewhere else, he can actually do again roaming. He can eventually do roaming with another IG. It's really mobile wireless stuff, but really to trigger this user, it will be DHCP, and IG maintain DHCP functionality. So there's a lot of confusing with our RAC people because they have this pool, there is a static pool. It's a range of address like we are used to in virtual template. but then there is a DHCP functionality in ISG, and then they're confused because who is actually handling DHCP? So I saw many times engineers telling the customer they need to configure GGSN for DHCP, which is not the case. Also, DHCP will be handled by ISG, but also ISG will be the default gateway, so you should be able to ping that default gateway. In the IWAC, he creates some interface called VIF, and that's actually what is kind of proxy tool. So there is some packet, and it's proxy to this network, and eventually go, in that case, to the GTP. And in the other case, it's really part of the broadcast network where you could potentially even have other normal subscribers. So if I'm only a Wi-Fi user and I'm not a mobile user, and I eventually log in to this Wi-Fi network as a visitor, but I'm not even have an agreement with this device here to go mobile wireless, I could maybe still access this, get a subscriber and do something else, not IWAC. So I could correlate both in the same box. Doesn't really cause any trouble. Or can I do this? You have a question?
Yeah. So I understand the first part. So when you are transitioning from wireless network to Wi-Fi, then you need to identify the client. So that's where you are. The client needs to get the discovery. Yeah, it's a DHCP class server. So the second access method which you're showing on the slide, so that's with the classified source MAC address. So like cable customers, when they're using the cable modems, it has a specific source MAC address, right? So will that come into that kind of access, the first sign of life, the access mode 2?
You could. From what I remember from at WAN, they don't even look at the cable MAC address, they look at the CPE behind the modem.
Right.
And eventually here, you could use MAC address, but assuming in that case it's a layer 2. So in that case, on the cable side, they probably do L2 VPN. If it's not an environment of layer 2, then you have a trouble, because if you go across a router like a CBR and you only dealing with layer 3, this MAC address will be the same all the time for all the packet. So in that case, it would be more like doing layer 3 in this case. So, but it's a bit depending on the topology, what you would eventually configure here. If you know you're dealing with the router before and the network of the customer or where your CPE is behind the routing protocols, then you know that the MAC address for all your subscriber will be the same. And maybe it's not the right choice to go for MAC address in that case. So a bit depending on how they configure this subscriber. If it's layer 2, they can do this L2 VPN in CBR8. Then they can forward via VLAN to this guy and eventually trigger it on DHCP, possible. If they decide they don't want to do L2 VPN on the CBR, they could potentially go for the IP address that was allocated on that subscriber. And or eventually, if he is doing NAT, the IP address that was allocated as a CPE point in the CBR. But you have, again, a different choice here in configuring it. But sometimes you have to make the right one, because, like I said, if you are behind the router and you select MAC address, then you will have one subscriber and everybody will go underneath that one. So maybe it's at that time not very useful.
Okay.
And for the, the question?
You're good. No, you're good.
So for DHCP, it's becoming very confusing. You will see some customer do layer 3. And when I mean DHCP layer 3, is because he has been crossing some device that is doing relay. So we have only one source in that case from that GI address. And then eventually that packet arrives here. So you can do DHCP layer 3, it picks up the address. Some DE will say it's not supported, but it's actually so it's working fine. Obviously, if you are behind a relay and you're trying to do layer 2 DHCP, it's confusing because the packet is not actually a layer 2 packet for DHCP. So sometimes, again, you need to be a bit reviewing what actually is on the back on this access network. So a bit of a question there on the topology of the customer. But anyway, once you have this site or you want to discover this user, you need to apply the service policy. And service policy type control, rule 1, that's the name that you have configured somewhere in the ISG to apply all the different events and action on event that you want the customer to go through. So let's stop this annotate. And I guess here we have another possibility, like we were talking before, activating the subscriber knowledge on the ISG with routed. So here we have the routed, which means we're going to pick up a layer 3 address, IPv4 or IPv6. It doesn't matter. And here again, if we don't know this IP address, for example, 10.1.2.14 as a subscriber, it means it's a new one, and then we try to apply the service type control rule that we have here. You can also do radius proxy. What is it used for? That's in the case of Wi-Fi. When you use WLC, you will see that in the case of WLC, often DHCP are actually provided by the WLC itself, which means you don't control it. It's a bit of a trouble, obviously, if you want to know when the session really is starting or is stopping. So what they invented here is radius proxy. What is it used for? The WRC when you associate, or the AP when you associate an IP address to a subscriber connecting via the wireless, and not mobile wireless, really wireless. It will send an accounting packet through the ISG. Why? Because in that case, for that box, the ISG is actually the radius server, and then at least for accounting, and then this accounting packet is target to ISG. ISG do the proxy of it, and that's the only case where you would see radius proxy really being useful. It's with ISG. So we pick up this IP address that was allocated by the WLC or AP, and we create the user with it, because we can actually look at it with this function here. So it's another way to create a subscriber. But only if you actually see this, you're almost sure that on the back there is some Wi-Fi network from an hospital or whatever they have, but it's probably huge Wi-Fi network on the back, controlled by those WRC and so on. Here you see that you can combine stuff. So in mobile wireless, for example, you will see often that DHCP is combined with initiator MAC address, because if the guy loses his connectivity, or the customer that is dealing with ISG has a session timeout, but eventually the session didn't really disappear, you can restart the session by having that packet coming into the ISG. Suppose he's sending an IP packet and ISG still is aware of this guy through the DHCP binding, you can restart the session. So you will see that's why you will see sometimes multiple initiator. It's normal, and it's completely supported. So once you have done with the IP, sometimes you will see people doing PPP. But this is very confusing, because this presentation is actually saying that you need to configure service policy type control, but actually not needed. If the user return in the radius some information about ISG, the subscriber will be ISG. It's becoming very confusing, especially these days when you actually forward the case of PPP to outsourcers and keep the ISG for you. Because looking at the config, you don't know if it's ISG or not. There's no way to actually recognize because this line here is not needed. Most of the customer will actually return an auto login function for PVP, and you will not see in the config just looking at the config that you're actually doing ISG. So sometimes you pick up a case after 2 months or 3 months when the author doesn't really know what he's doing with the ISG, and you of course at that time customer is a bit pissed. So you can configure PPP, and you see it's actually exactly the same as you would eventually create a termination for PPP in a box with PPP enable here, and the virtual template associated to this BBA group here. So for the customer, nothing changed. Obviously, you can configure a service type control. You probably will see this from new customer in ISG, but it's actually not needed. And obviously here, the first sign of life is this PADI coming in from the end subscriber. Then you have also other stuff, which is nice. It's an IP subscriber interface, so you don't need to have really a packet to trigger it. As soon as this interface comes up, it's actually up. So when everything that is coming under that interface is part of the same subscriber, regardless of the IP that is crossing it. So it's another way. So this is interesting if you want to create a lot of radius packet at the same time. Some customer had this, and we actually create a 2000 sub-interface, and you trigger 2000 radius packet at the same time, because as soon as the gig 01 comes up, he actually triggers a lot of radius packet. It's an easy way to create some stuff, even maybe for other devices that have some trouble. We're just doing this, and as you will send all the radius packet. So to send a radius packet, we obviously need to configure radius, and this is actually an old version of configuring. Now you need to configure, but still a lot of customers use this version. You need to configure a radius server name and entering IP address and so on. But basically, like I say, radius, you only need a username and password. And the functionality of radius, it can do authentication and it can do accounting. All what you can do with the radius server. Send a username and a password on this, because this is the authentication port, and send an accounting packet with this port as a destination. Obviously, ScienceE needs to make sure the password is encrypted. You have this key here. For the rest, all the other attributes are in clear. So you can sniff it. It's a lot more easy than TACACS. Don't try to do TACACS with ISG. It's going to be a pain. You don't need this specifically. Radius can actually send the packet automatically using the port where it's coming from. So it's not really needed to have a source rollback. What you need to configure in the radius is some NAS IP address, so you need to be able to recognize this ISG. Many customers actually, when they start installing radius, they forget this, and then you have access reject, but you don't know why, or you have no reply at all. So when the radius configure the ISG, you need to configure this under the client function. So in the lab you have also some server. So I don't have the correct keyboard, so I hope I don't type too many mistakes. But if you have some radius server, and this is actually one of the virtual machines where we work on, each user can actually have his own radius in this machine. So that's what I built. You see, I already did a typo. So if I go to the radius server and I do less...
Alan, I'm not sure if you're sharing your VM because we are only seeing the slide.
Oh, sorry. I don't know why it's... I was sharing...
I think you only shared your application instead of the whole screen.
Yeah, I don't know why. Okay, so screen. So here it's my radius, and like I said, in that virtual machine I will install in the lab later on, you will all have this. So let me try to increase a bit this stuff, if I can. No, not with that. It doesn't like. Okay, so here, this client. So in a radius, when you configure a NAS, you actually need to give a client. And this is here in the free radius. It's interesting because you can actually put an entire network. But basically, it needs to be defined. And obviously, you define the same key then you would eventually define here in the radius. Once you have done this, the radius is able to understand that when you send something, you're part of one of its clients. Now, if you didn't configure the client, it will probably don't reply. It will not reply at all to your requests. Some of them, they actually send access reject because they don't understand where it's coming from, but they still reply. So it's a bit confusing, especially if you get into access reject case. Actually, it was just a problem with the client, and customer did not configure it, and you start debugging, but actually it's just a stupid config. And if obviously if it doesn't configure the right secret, you will also get access reject all the time because the calculation will not get right. So this is what he needs to configure in his radius. Obviously, your radius need to listen to the ports that you have enabled. In our case, in the lab, if I have a radius that I can restart, this is a small script. If you will, okay. So the script is this one. Let me try if I accept it like that. And then here I can start. It's an old version. This one I've done a new version before. Start. I could start a radius, and actually the script is listening now to those ports for authentication. If my colleague start his own radius, he's probably going to use something else. It's always ending with those ports, but I can do now a test for myself with this, and as you can see, this is what he would eventually, you have a default configuration here to access this machine. So if the machine is in US, this IP address will change, but automatically the script is building the configuration, and I could eventually pass this into the config of the SG instead of this old configuration that here's used here. You have the same for BNG if one day you need to do BNG. So now we have configured radius, and you can send a username and a password. Then we have the trouble of AAA. Load of confusion, especially if you do BNG and ISG together, because ISG and BNG react a bit differently. So I don't know if you are aware of those AA commands, but AAA means authentication, authorization, and accounting, and a lot of people confuse AAA with radius. AAA is the functionality inside iOS XE, iOS, and actually also iOS XR, and is dealing with authentication, accounting, and authorization. And it deals with server he wants. So potentially AA could talk to attack server, could talk to diameter, like it's the case in iOS XE today, and eventually BNG. So, or you could talk to radius. Most of the ISG cases are actually with radius. And the radius can be whatever, you know. As long eventually if I would configure a stack that can do this secret key, I would be able to communicate with this ISG without him even knowing I'm not the radius server. So that's why in a lab free radius is, for example, working fine, and a lot of customers actually use free radius. So the first stuff, you actually need to decide what you're going to do. And in case of authorization, you configure authorization. In case of authentication, you will do authentication. It's already a big trouble in ISG, because what is the case of PvP when he arrives? Is it an authentication? Is it an authorization? Sometimes you don't really know. What I do when I'm not very sure. I configure the line under SSG, and then if it's not okay, if he cannot find the corresponding AA line, he will complain. Then you can start configuring the AA line. If you miss and you type authentication instead of authorization, when you retype the config on IG, it will still complain. So you know it's actually the other one. So if you're not sure. But of course, during the training, we'll go and specify this, but it's a nice trick. If you configure, just change. For example, login, it's usually used by the customer to log in a user inside the router with exec functionalities. But with ISG, we can use this functionality to do an account logon. So you will be logging. Network authorization is most of the authorization, and again with ISG, it's very confusing because if you don't have an authorization for subscriber service, it will fall back to the network authorization. So across upgrades, sometimes they've changed the behavior. We had to complain the logic was not okay, so maybe some version will work one way, some version will be corrected. But normally, if you try to authorize a service, which actually means somewhere in your service policy that you were attaching to that interface that we saw previously, you're saying to the guy, you need to authorize your MAC address. Why? Because it's an IP and you have only the MAC address to actually try to recognize the user with radius. So you say authorize. In that case, it's not a subscriber service. It's going to be using this one, and it's going to go through a radius. Which radius? The one that is defined here, and this is actually the radius server. So step one, what do we want to do? Authorize. What type of authorization? Like I say, ISG is sometimes confusing. In the case of a subscriber, you're probably going to go through this one, and then you go to the server. In the case of a subscriber service, this means when you assign a service to the customer and you need to find out what parameter this service has, you also can authorize via radius or local. In this case, you see he first try locally and then he will try radius. So in that case, you really need the subscriber service. But like I said, ISG can fall back to this one if this one is not configured. So sometimes behavior is a bit complicated, but eventually if you debug AA, you will also see which AAA list he actually picks up or which one he's looking for. And if you debug AAA, you can really see, am I dealing with an authorization or am I dealing with an attempt? Because a debug will show this between brackets that he's doing attempt, and he's looking for a list. In the debug, it's method list. So you can really find out. There's also a lot of typo sometimes that the customer don't know why, but they like to have complicated name, and then they have the complicated name here, and then when they configure the ISG, they have a typo. So obviously the list is not found, and the subscriber doesn't come up, and it's just a typo. Instead of staying logic, it seems to have some ideas on configuring names that doesn't make much sense sometimes. So here is to configure accounting. So you have a periodic every 5 minutes. It will actually send an accounting. And the accounting is dealt with this one here. And you see network, account list. What does it do? At start, stop, I will actually send something. So far, we just have configured AAA. We haven't talked about ISG yet. Actually what it's doing, except we know we have learned the subscriber, but that's pretty much it. This is the kind of configuration that you would also see with the normal PVP users. That's why I say when you do PVP ISG, you have all this stuff. If you start seeing this line, maybe you can imagine you're actually dealing with ISG, but like I said, you can also fall back to this one. So some will not even have the subscriber service line. Then you deal with all these attributes that you want to include in an access request, some requests of the customer. Sometimes you will see cases there. Customer says, I have included, I don't know, some information from my call station ID, and it's not included in the request. So you need to find out a call station ID will be attribute 31. Is not here, I guess. Maybe at the time of the presentation was not supported, but you can actually act on the call station ID. This is to send the vendor specific attribute that ISG can produce inside a packet. So for example, if the customer is interested by having the ISG information of a service, you better enable this one. So it's always enabled. You see, you will always see this in the config until the day some new guy is coming with an ISG and actually doesn't configure it, and then you will wonder, you know, since you have maybe 5 ISG keys a year, and then by the time the guy that will configure ISG is like 2 or 3 years later, so you forget completely about this VSA, and then you start wondering why he's actually not sending the vendor specific attribute, but is this one. So happens to me once that I was searching and actually forgot those 2 lines. So a bit confusing on this attribute, this part here, I would say here, because that's how you configure radius. But if I would look at some of my radius, maybe a bit clearer. So this is how I configure my radius, and probably pretty much in car you have also some submenu with free radius is actually a lot more easy. You see here that's actually for VPN, but there's probably some ISG configuration we can go through. With free radius, a lot of possibility of regular expression and so on. So let me check if I have some basic one. A basic user. This is for service. Okay. Check. So, for example, this is a basic user. So some of the stuff I was reproducing, you have a user coming in inside your ISG. He has this username, and then I was using Cisco. And then you see here some attribute that you can actually provide when the user login. This is eventually, I guess, what they're configured here. Cisco account info. You see here, or you actually configure this inside free radius. Maybe the car will have another way of spelling it. Maybe the A will not be uppercase, or it will be with some underscore. This is all depending on the dictionary of the radius. So, how does the radius recognize that Cisco account info is something you actually need to send? Because when you send a packet on the wire, obviously you don't send something with Cisco account info. What you send on the wire is some attributes, and the attributes, they all have numbers. So for example, Cisco, since it's vendor specific, it will first look at the RFC dictionary and find out what is vendor specific attributes. It's the RFC says it's 26. And then since it's Cisco has ID 9, so you will see on the wire 26.9, and then some value that is corresponding to this Cisco account info, which is 250. Now, how to remember this, I don't know, so I actually have a better way. I do quit. If you go to this machine that we will use later on, you have this dictionary here. So if you do cat dictionary, he's actually pointing me the path of this place where I free radius all the dictionaries, which is nice because I can do a CD to that directory. And there I have all the radius. RFC, if I look in the RFC, the first RFC dictionary, I will see the attribute 26 points to a vendor specific, and then you can see I have all the vendor specific. Even for Cisco, I have like 4 different dictionaries. So if I look into this one, I will probably see the ISG stuff. So here I have Cisco vendor, and you can see actually mentioning 9, which is my ID for Cisco stuff. If I go to waste, and I will be using something else. Cisco AV pair is defined as attribute 1, so potentially on the wire I will see 26 vendor specific, 9 Cisco, 1 will be representing the Cisco AV pair. So when that packet arrives at the ISG knows, oh, it's actually a Cisco AV pair, 2691, and then when you debug radius, you will see Cisco AV pair, and you will not see 2691, except in the column B. Near Cisco AV pair, you will see maybe 26 and some length and so on. You see that not only ISG is using this dictionary, they have a lot of stuff for fax, for voice, and so if I look into the 250 range, I will see my stuff here, which is dealing with ISG. So 3 attributes in this dictionary of Cisco that is actually dealing with ISG. Plus this one, because this one is used in a COA packet, so you will see this one sometimes also. Obviously, we also use all the rest of the attributes. Sometimes you will see a Cisco AV pair being used for establishing an access list on the user. We also use the Cisco AV pair to maybe some other keys. For example, BNG on iOS XR never use those 250 range. He always uses Cisco AV pair all the time. A bit more easy to remember. But since this one was designed in SSG before, they kept the same stuff in ISG. That's why. So a customer sometimes asks, I cannot find in the dictionary, or have to put these rules here, like for example, IP index. He would never find it, because it's not the job of the radius server to know what the iOS wants. It's the job of the radius server is just to know how to need to code this Cisco AV pair. The rest, he doesn't care. Because that same Cisco AV pair will be used for iOS XR, will be used for iOS XE. If you change version, across version, maybe instead of using IP here, you would need to use IPv4. You never know. So why would actually the radius dictionary be aware of that value? I don't know. But the customer thought it should. But actually it was wrong. So this is really proper to the iOS or box you're running with. And again, you will see that sometimes some devices accept attributes from other vendor. Like for example, we accept some of the ASN attributes, and ASN probably accept one of the Cisco AV pair attributes because they're doing competition with us. So it's not forbidden. In this case, when you actually define the user, we see username, because radius always need a username. We don't see the password defined. I suppose it is in his radius profile. Then he actually give him some session timeout and some idle timeout functionality. So session timeout is an absolute timeout. Idle timeout is eventually when there's no traffic. This is the way or you can actually assign an accounting list to the subscriber, and it's part of the session. So this is when the subscriber is authenticated or authorized, we have created the session. We haven't done anything yet on the service part. We'll see later on what service part is. So you can also apply costs, or that's actually exactly the same than what you would do with a normal PVP user. Nothing changed because of ISG. You can do all of this stuff. If you still have some customer doing ATM, you actually need to configure an ATM cost. But I doubt you will actually see this. You can assign the user in the VRF same way as you would deal with a normal PVP termination. Exactly the same way. So, concept of service. This is where people start getting trouble. So maybe I will draw something before, if I can. Yeah, I still have 10 minutes something. So let's go to this one. I hope I'm logged in.
Hey, Alan, one question. For Radius server configuration, do you have any documentation that we can refer?
You mean like these attributes and so on we were saying? Or?
Right.
Actually, what I do now, since we have a lot of people doing lab, I'm using this one, my radiuses. So you were seeing that machine also you can actually use. So let's see the radius. So example, a lot of example in this radius server, and you can actually once people have done the lab, you can actually verify the lab. I will put some of the default one, so you have some good example. The rest you will need to look at CCO documentation to code them. For BNG, there is a nice page. For ISG, not all the time, but eventually you will see in a topic how to code it. So I never find really some place where you have this, but there is some rules. So normally you need to look at protocol, what you want to do, and the value. It's always normally like this, but it's not always easy to find exactly the right spelling. So, but like I say, you will see a lot of example, and after sometimes you don't need to because you know them by heart, or you still can refer to the wages where you have done some config. For example, for IWAC, we will do some tests, or you will have them. They can refer to this. So let me. I don't remember my password actually. Let's. And I have trouble with. Maybe I can do here some. Not now. And maybe there's some drawing stuff. This is my drawing. No. I think I will have to return to the other one. I don't know what. I think it was this, like I said. Sorry, not that one. I have a lot of trouble with my PC. It just fell on the ground when I was actually arriving at home. So one screen is completely blocked. And I had to put some keyboards, but it's an AZERTY, so it's a bit of a trouble. Hope it's not the right one. Or maybe it's like this. No. Okay, so let me open maybe some other stuff to draw. Maybe that. Yeah. So the concept of a service, very confusing for people at the beginning. Delete. So what is actually arriving in the SG? If I take this, it's a packet. We know we can discover and we can go into the knowledge of IP subscriber. So we will eventually create a session. And the session, all the IP address information of a subscriber. On that session, we will add the service. So if you do show subscriber session and that session ID, you will see all the information. If you do IWAC or if you do something else, you will see it there. But once that session is installed, and eventually I could create session 1 here, I will eventually need to apply some specific stuff that will potentially be completely different than another session. if I have a session 2, I need to apply some other service. Suppose this one is actually allowed to go directly to the internet without paying anything. How do I recognize it? Maybe because the MAC address was arriving and I authenticate this MAC address. Probably dangerous, because if somebody steals his MAC address, he will have free internet access. Or maybe we could be in a situation where I'm actually in the airport and session 1 is already active. For some reason, lost the IP address and then comes back. During the time he lost the IP address, the session timed out, but since he paid for 24 hours, he's still able to actually restart the session. So we can restart the session directly, while this one here needs eventually to go through a portal to pay. A lot of different stuff that I need to apply to different sessions. And eventually they all come via that same unique interface. So what is the concept of service? Is really you will open a big pipe, I would say, from that interface to the routing of the router. You have this concept. Before, with the SSG, if you ever look at it, it had the concept of different service objects, but here it's really opening it to the pipe, the router. Whatever is here, it's actually my routing. Am I able to access it? Maybe. Am I be able to stop? I'm not able to access it? Maybe. I don't know yet. And that's the tricky part of the SSG. What is actually configured? It's not like you configure BGP or ISIS, you know what to expect. With ISG, you don't know what to expect. Actually, to achieve something with a session, you could do it maybe 3 different ways and it will still work. And obviously, you need to learn those ways when you're actually on the call with the customer. If you're trying to find some documentation, maybe if you have the documentation of the customer. But really, you don't know. So, and eventually the customer, you were used to use something and they actually change, so you need to review again everything. So actually I have those most pipe here, and I will actually design probably like this. Okay. When do I hit those small pipe is actually when I match something. And I will do Control-C for this one. I could eventually have multiple of those small pipes. So if my packet arrives now, what choice do I have when I go through this? Do I go there? Or maybe I go there? Or maybe I go there if there's another pipe? Don't know how to choose it. Actually, the only way to really make sure he enters the right pipe is to match. How do we match? This is with an access list. So here somewhere before entering that small pipe, there is an ACL. And then again, confusion because people say ACL deny. Obviously, packet should be dropped. Actually, in the concept of SG, it's not the case. When you actually deny, you just don't want to match it. Do you match it later in another part? Maybe. Do you match it in the default? Definitely. So that's another confusion. If I look at having different pipe here, I'll do copy.
So is ACL is the only way to channelize the sessions between?
No, channelize the traffic.
Yeah, channelize the traffic. But for different subscribers, right?
Yeah. So this what I'm drawing here will happen for each subscriber. So each session will have this functionality. That's why eventually what I have configured here, and I will copy it and do past. I can reproduce it here, but I can also have different stuff here for this one. You know, or instead of having multiple pipe, I could have only one, which is actually maybe this guy, like I said, was able to go directly to internet. Actually, all this traffic is automatically put into this pipe because they go to internet. There's no other functionality in that session. In this one, obviously, I need to we'll change the color. I need to be able to move across all those. And eventually here I have this default. And suppose I check this pipe first. Do I match something? For this, I check the ACL attached to this pipe. No, I don't match. Here I was explicit. I had an explicit deny, so I definitely don't match. So I go to default. I saw one guy in US. He was doing this in a 10K for at least 2 years, and the default was not dropping. So what he was doing, he was having a pipe to do redirection, and he was working very fine. When the HTTP packet was arriving, matching the ACL, okay, it's a match. We enter this pipe. What does this pipe do? It actually redirect packet. Okay, I redirect packet. I go to portal. The redirection works. And for him, control plane is working fine because he's looking at this PC here. He's being redirected to the portal. Everything is fine. Everything works. Okay. Then he upgrade to ISV, and because some different way of processing the accounting was done in ISV, his session didn't came up anymore. So I told him, you need to put that under the service. And then he put it on the service, and I told him, you still have a big trouble because actually, since you do not match anywhere HTTPS, like here, he didn't match because he was only controlling HTTP. In his open garden, he was only allow traffic to the portal. So for him, the config was okay. What he forgot, it was to default drop. So HTTPS was going to default drop. So every YouTube traffic could go through the default drop. And even though HTTP and redirection seems to work fine, I mean, and they were working fine. At the same time, you could serve YouTube for free. And he didn't believe in until we actually established the ISV. And then I say, okay, it's working fine. Yeah, it's working right. Okay, stop the user. Put him unauthorized and try YouTube. Is it working? Yes. He was working, and he was also working for his 10K for a few years already. So in Poland, this default one, here the last one. So here, we make the selection, we know it's an ACL. What's in the pipe is the functionality you want to give to that pipe, like I say, redirection, cost or whatever. And what is this function is the service. So a service will match something and do something. So what is installed here is actually installed by the service. And now you match the service with an ACL. So that's the concept of service in ISV. And once you have matched the pipe and you have gone through this one, you actually enter the router. And there you can go wherever you want, as long as you have the routing for it. So that's why if you go through default drop, you can serve YouTube, because if there is no match here and no default drop here, it will go through. And that's the function of ISG. Many customers actually forgot, especially those that were coming from SSG, because SSG was the other opposite. He was doing default drop by default. And if you didn't have correctly a service object, session object, or I don't remember what they called it, and the connection object, you couldn't send any traffic. With ISG, if you match one of those pipes, and unfortunately default match everything, if it was not matching there, you go through. Well, maybe it's a good time to actually do the break. And
yeah, so let's do a 5 minutes break. So let me stop the recording.
Mm-hmm.